All right, class, welcome. Module 2, Second Industrial Revolution. Let me make sure I'm sharing this properly. So, some guiding questions that you should be able to answer at the end of the unit. How did this period change the American economy? We'll go over several examples of that. What impacts did this period have on how people lived, worked, traveled, and communicated? What were some externalities of this period of the Second Industrial Revolution? I want to pause here and define that term externality in the context of business practices. An externality is I guess a ripple effect, an external effect, an outside effect on certain behavior. So, for example, during this period of the Second Industrial Revolution, we have the first modern factories, okay? And one externality of someone running a factory could be pollution, for example. So an externality is something that affects someone either positively or negatively, but usually the connotation is it's a negative effect. Something that affects someone who's not directly engaged in the activity. So, so for example, if there's a factory that is polluting the water of the city that the factory is located in, that's an externality because it's affecting not just people that are directly engaged, not just people who work at the factory or own the factory. It's affecting people that have nothing to do with the factory because it's polluting the water that everyone has to drink in this example. Another quick example of an externality would be secondhand smoke. This might shock you. When I was in college, late 90s, early 2000s, we could smoke in our dorm rooms, in the dining hall. And now, like your generation would be like, what? What? You can't do that. It's crazy, right? And that's because about 25 years ago, it was determined that secondhand smoke was an example of an externality. Because in this context, the secondhand smoke was being breathed in not just by the smoker, but by people that had nothing to do with the smoker's behavior. So that makes it an externality. And externalities usually need to be regulated, need to be controlled, need to be limited or forbidden. So there's lots of externalities that come with this period, things that affect the society at large rather than just the people doing the thing. How did this relationship affect the government's relationship, or this period rather, affect the government's relationship with citizens and businesses? In a lot of the units we'll cover, I'll ask you a similar question at the beginning. How did this period affect the role and the size and the scope of government? So during this period, electrical power, which we all take for granted, but it's relatively new, it replaces the earlier forms of industrial power, which were steam and water power. Faster transportation helped move people and goods quicker and therefore more cheaply. So it started with electric streetcars, as you can see here, and then we get into internal combustion engines, we get into trucks and automobiles and airplanes, etc. And as our ability to travel more quickly escalates, this phrase comes into play: the world begins to shrink. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically, it does seem during this period and today, right? There's a lot of parallels with today. The world has never seemed smaller because people that are separated by a distance of 1,000 miles, let's say. Well, during this period, look, for all of human history, the fastest way to travel was basically jump on a horse and see how fast the horse can run, right? Now, all of a sudden, during this period, we have cars and airplanes. Now you can travel much more quickly. So the distance of 1,000 miles, for example, is not as significant as it was. And now in our timeline, the world's even smaller because now to connect with people 1,000 miles away, you don't need to jump on an airplane. Uh, you can just jump on a Zoom meeting and there you are, instantly in contact with someone that's on the other side of the planet. That makes the world seem smaller because people over great distances can be connected, whether it's physically or now it would just be virtually through the internet. And that carries a whole range of effects in terms of business, in terms of society, um, for good or for bad, right? We are more connected more quickly with each other over great distances than ever before. And that really starts to escalate during this period that we're getting into here. In terms of industrial activity, this is one anecdotal example of how quickly things changed during this period. The Bessemer process has to do with how steel is created. And without getting into the details, because frankly, I don't know many of the specific details of this, the time to create a ton of steel due to this new process at the time exponentially shrunk. It went from taking roughly a day, which is almost 1,500 minutes, to taking 10 minutes. So that means in a day, you can create 150 times as much steel as previously. That's going to lead to an explosive increase in the production of steel. And that's going to have all kinds of externalities and ripple effects. An example of this, you can kind of plug in those numbers in the first point to see a practical outcome in the second point. During the 1870s, the first full decade after the Civil War, annual steel production in the US went from 77,000 tons to over a million. That's over a tenfold increase. All right. So that is a radical expansion in productivity. The ripple effects and of the great acceleration in just this one example of steel, well, here's one. New York City, the bridges, the buildings, the entire infrastructure of the modern city of New York would not be possible without this leap forward in industrial productivity with steel, for example. Now, New York City, it existed in some primitive form all the way back into the 1600s, way before the United States existed. I think you are aware of that. But New York City as it exists today would not be possible without mass production of steel. And here's why. Let's just talk about the island of Manhattan specifically. It's pretty small, Manhattan. How is it that there are a few million people living on a very small footprint of land? Well, that wouldn't be possible if it weren't for this steel production. Because on a plot of land as small as the island of Manhattan, there's only so much space. You're not going to fit 2, 3, 4 million people on an island that size unless you have steel. Why? Because with steel, you can build up. You can't make the island bigger, but you sort of can with steel because you can build up rather than out horizontally. Okay. So that allows for you to have skyscrapers. And that allows for, let's say you have a footprint of land of any given size in New York City. And before this, when we're talking brick and mortar, wood and brick, um, you might have a 4-story building and that can only fit so many people. Well, with steel, you can build a 100-story building, a building of a height that could never be supported by just timber and bricks. But with steel, you can build a building that's 1,000 feet tall, of which there are several in New York City, as you probably know. So on that footprint where there used to be a 4-story building, now there's a 100-story building. So now you have 25 times as many people that can be in that same area. So that's how you get modern American cities with steel. So that has a huge effect on how many people can live in certain areas, how quickly they can travel around those areas, etc. Greatly increased steel production also led to the rapid expansion of railroads. The railroads might seem kind of old-timey to you. They're still in use much more than you might imagine. Um, and with railroads, so you can have people and goods traveling more quickly, which means more cheaply, which means people and places are much more interconnected and the world seems smaller. And one other thing that we take for granted that you might find interesting, another technology that comes online in this period is refrigeration. So refrigerated shipping cars and trains, for example. That technology opens up areas to being able to acquire previously impossible to acquire goods. Okay. And in the context of refrigeration, we're specifically talking about perishable goods, specifically food. Okay. If you want to ship a book across the country, that that's fine. Uh, you can ship that book on horseback and it might take a few months to reach the destination, but as long as you're patient, you're going to get your book. But obviously you can't do that with something perishable, something that will rot because time is of the essence, right? But with a refrigerated train car, you can preserve perishable goods for longer. And that means that product, that perishable good, can get to markets that previously would have been impossible. So here's a trivial example, but it's not that trivial when you think about it. Bananas. Now, I assume we all live in New England. And let's say it's February and there's a foot of snow on the ground outside. We all take it for granted that you can walk into a supermarket in the middle of winter in Massachusetts with a foot of snow on the ground outside, and you have immediate access in that supermarket to fresh, affordable, tropical fruit, like bananas, for example. We take that for granted. Take a step back and think about that. That's insane. For all of human history, nobody who lived in our part of the world, in New England, would have ever had access to bananas. How could they? Bananas are not grown in our climate, as you know. Um, Bananas mostly come from places like, well, Guatemala and the Philippines are two of the biggest producers of bananas because of their climate. Before this technology exists, how would you get a banana from someone from Guatemala to someone who lives in Massachusetts? You're going to put it on a ship and have that ship sail from Guatemala to Massachusetts. By the time the ship gets there and offloads those bananas have rotted into mush, right? It's not going to happen. So, but with refrigeration and quicker shipping through trains, all of a sudden we have access to perishable goods that previously we would have never had access to. You understand? That radically shapes our diets, our expectations. Think about what your diet would look like if you lived in Massachusetts, let's say, and this technology didn't exist. Your diet would consist entirely of food that was raised and produced and harvested within, let's say, 30 miles of your house, right? So, you would have access to apples, and that's great, but no bananas, no avocados, no oranges. You understand? It would be impossible for you in our part of the world, in our climate, to have access to perishable goods that are grown in tropical climates. But now all of a sudden, because of this technology, we can, and add that to the very long list of things that we take for granted. This is also the beginning of the fossil fuel era, starting with coal and then oil and then natural gas. There's a lot going on in this graphic here, but what I want to make sure you understand is that when you think about oil, let's say, and the role it plays in our economy and our society, it's not just the oil itself. And so during this period, people with the new machines and the new technology were able to experiment with ways to drill down deep beneath the earth to where oil is, and to build machines to extract that oil out from under the earth, and then to build machines to refine that oil into gasoline or some other form of fuel. The other thing that I want to make sure you understand about oil is that when you're thinking about the role that oil plays in our economy, it's not just the product itself. It's not just the oil or the gasoline. Oil is in all kinds of products that you might not realize. And the big one that opens up the door to all kinds of other things is plastic. Okay. We use plastic in this country, for better or for worse, all day, every day. It's in all kinds of products, including products you might not think of as being, quote, plastic. Plastic is in most clothing that we wear these days. Plastic is in electronics. Plastic is in eating and drinking containers. Plastic is in cars. It's in rugs. It's in furniture. Our modern economy would not exist without plastic. And plastic can't be made without oil. So when you think about oil and the role it plays, and should we get off oil and all these other things, it's a much bigger issue than it might appear. Okay. So fossil fuels, and then also the secondary products from fossil fuels, of which oil is a major one. All right. So I was telling my oldest son the other day, you got a kick out of this. Oil, it's called fossil fuels for a reason, right? It's from fossilized animals that died millions of years ago. So oil is mostly from dinosaurs that died and were, gradually decayed and sunk below the earth to certain levels over millions of years. And there's certain combinations of heat and pressure that are required to turn those fossilized dinosaurs over millions of years into this thing that we call oil. So a dinosaur dies 50 million years ago. Over the eons, it turns into oil. We figure out how to extract that oil. We turn that oil into plastic, and we turn that plastic into toy dinosaurs. Therefore, toy dinosaurs are made from real dinosaurs. Um, my 11-year-old got a kick out of that one. Uh, Electricity is something we take for granted, but it's relatively new. Thomas Edison invented, or developed would probably be a better word, but he's given credit for inventing the electric light bulb. Think about the externalities of that, the effects on business and domestic life. Just on business, before reliable electric illumination, before light bulbs, you would, practically speaking, you would have to shut down a factory at sunset. You'd have to. It's not practical or particularly safe to illuminate an entire factory with what, thousands and thousands of candles. So practically speaking, business and domestic life pretty much wound down when the sun went down. You could sit by your little kerosene lamp and read a book after dark, of course, but you can't do big scale business activity. But now you can. So now, let's say a factory that might have only been open for 12 hours because they need sunlight. Now, if they want to, and it makes business sense, that factory can stay open for 24 hours because we have artificial electric light. And therefore, in that example, that factory could double its productivity. Make sense? That's a big leap. Um, Other things that might sound trivial that you might not consider. Houses are, safer and are able to keep different hours, and people can have different schedules when there's reliable electric illumination. City streets now are lit up at night. Would that not make cities safer? Would it not make driving, for example, because cars emerged during this same time window, it's going to be a lot safer to drive at night when the streets are lit up with electric street lamps. Would it not reduce crime in cities to some degree? When city streets are lit up, it's harder for criminals to get away with stuff under cover of darkness. There's all kinds of externalities to widespread electricity in business, in domestic life, in all manner of things. The telephone. Alexander Graham Bell is usually given credit as developing the telephone. Again, this is nothing new to us, but at the time, try to imagine this. At the time, this was science fiction. The idea that you could talk in real time directly to someone that's 500 miles away. You can speak into a device and they immediately hear your voice and they can speak back to you and you can have a conversation with someone as if they're in the room, even if they're 500 miles away. We all take that for granted now. At the time, that was science fiction. And then all of a sudden it became real. And that is another reminder of the world continues to shrink. You can have a real-time conversation with someone 500 miles away without leaving your house. The impacts of that on family life, the impacts of that on business are remarkable. You don't need to travel for a business meeting. You can just pick up a telephone. You don't need to travel hundreds of miles to see your relative. You can pick up the telephone. It's a radical thing. And again, another example, another reminder of how today with our technology, we're living on the cutting edge of this. Okay. Um, the idea of being able to connect with family members, for example. So my grandmother died geez, 8 years ago now, I guess. And at the time, she was in Ohio. I was in Rhode Island at the time. And my daughter had just been born. She was a couple months old. And I wanted to go see my grandmother, but it's not realistic. I'm not going to travel halfway across the country with an infant. And but I was able to talk to her, and more importantly, for her and for me, I was able to show her her great granddaughter, um, who was an infant, a couple months old, and she was able to look at the face of my daughter, of her great granddaughter, before she died. And because of the technology that we had, we could FaceTime. That's just a logical extension of the telephone, right? But it's the same principle. That interaction, which means a lot in situations like that, you can imagine, that wouldn't have been possible before all this new technology that starts emerging during this period. It radically shapes how we communicate. Do we even need to travel to talk to people? Starting with the telephone, it's not necessary anymore. And now, of course, with the technology we have, it's even less necessary. Modern automobiles. Henry Ford, you've probably all heard of him. The Model T automobile. So this was not the first car, but it was the first car that was designed to be mass produced and to be affordable for average people rather than being a luxury item. Each car was identical, and Ford famously said, you can have it in any color as you want as long as it's black. Because each car was identical and they had interchangeable parts and everyone was black and they're identical in every way, kind of makes them boring, but also from a business point of view, if each product is identical, you can produce them much more rapidly, much more rapidly. And with the moving assembly line, right, that's when the car is coming down an assembly line and each person is at a different spot in the line and that person has a specific job. They're going to put on the lug nuts and then the car is going to keep going to the next person who's going to do the headlights or whatever else. And that kind of automation and that standardization and the fact that every part is the same, that means they're going to be produced rapidly. And Ford got it to the point where they're making a car every hour and a half, rather. And they were sold at the time in the early 20th century for $500. Now, I hope you understand inflation. We'll get into some examples of that later in the course. $500 back then was the equivalent in 2020 of about $13,000, right? But that is a price point that most average Americans could wrap their head around and could probably afford. And so think about that price tag of $13,000 in 2020. Um, does the average American now have $13,000 in the bank to where they can write a check that won't bounce for $13,000 to buy a car? No, no, the average American does not have $13,000 in cash on hand. But can the average American finance a loan and afford the monthly payments on a loan for $13,000 to buy a car? Yes, they can. And so that's what that $500 is about. It doesn't mean that everyone in the country had $500 in cash. That wasn't true at all. But a significant proportion of Americans could borrow $500 and pay it off over the course of a few years and have a car. This is no longer just for wealthy people. Powered flights, the Wright brothers, first powered flight in 1903. They flew 120 feet over a beach in North Carolina in 12 seconds. That was the first flight. And this is an example of how history begins to speed up. And just like the world's shrinking, of course, it's not literal, but it seems that way. And we are, again, this is your reality and mine. History moves much more quickly now, it seems that way at least, than ever before. Let me explain this. For all of human history, with very few exceptions, the day-to-day life of average people didn't radically change. So, for example, if you lived in some little village in France in the year 200, your life would not be radically different from someone who lived in that same little village in France 1,000 years later. You know what I'm saying? On a day-to-day basis, in terms of the technology, your routine, whatever else, you could have two people living in an area 1,000 years apart, and their lives are very, very similar. Now, for us, as you know, that's over. That's over. The technology now evolves so quickly that our day-to-day lives are radically different from people even 40 years ago. And that's going to continue to be true, especially for your generation. Here's an example about flight that illustrates that. The time that elapsed between these two events you see pictured here, the first powered flight and the first moon landing, the time elapsed between these two events was 66 years. All right, a single human lifetime. And think about it like this. It took all of human history, however you define that, took all of human history. Most scientists estimate that the first Homo sapiens emerged about 300,000 years ago. So let's use that number. It took 300,000 years for people to figure out how to fly 120 feet. Now, on that scale of progress, right, it took 300,000 years to figure out how to fly a canvas glider with like a moped engine strapped to it, basically, 120 feet. At that pace, how long should it have taken between these two events, between flying a primitive glider over a beach for 120 feet to flying a 500,000 miles round trip through the vacuum of outer space, landing on another world, and coming back to the Earth, which is 1,000,000 times more complicated than flying a glider, right? How long should that have taken? If it took 300,000 years to do what the Wright brothers did, how long should have elapsed between the Wright brothers and the first moon landing? I don't know, 10 million years. You understand what I'm saying? but it took 66 years because the development of technology, it's going like this for all of human history. Flat, 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 flat. Then all of a sudden, boom, through the roof exponential growth. The world changes radically every 20 years now. That's a brand new thing that starts in this era. In terms of business practices, modern corporations begin to replace older business models. One thing that made that possible was stocks. I'm sure you've heard of stocks. Portions of ownership. You can own a little sliver of a huge business by buying stock. And one thing that makes that more attractive and more practical for average people is the idea of limited liability. If you invest in a company by buying stock, that company might fail, but your liability, your responsibility, what you're on the hook for if that happens, is limited. It's limited to whatever money you invested in that business. If you buy $1,000 worth of stock in a business and that business fails, the bad news is you've lost your $1,000. The good news is your loss is limited to that money that you directly put into that business. In other words, if that business fails in this example, other people can't come to you and say, hey, you were part of that business. We're going to take your house. We're going to take your car. They can't do that. They're limited, right? And your potential downside is limited, which makes it more realistic and more attractive to take a risk by investing money in businesses because you know, even if it goes bad, you're not going to lose everything you have. Your loss will be limited. That makes things more secure and more predictable. Other business practices. Andrew Carnegie, we were just talking about steel. He was kind of the quintessential steel tycoon. Practiced a business model called vertical integration. This is a form of monopoly, which we'll get to in a minute. Vertical integration as in up and down. You see it pictured here. Vertical integration means you own the businesses involved in each step from top to bottom of a manufacturing process. So let's talk about steel, for example. You don't just go find steel growing on trees. It's a multi-step process. It's a little oversimplified here, but that's fine. First is the mining. You need to dig into the earth to find iron ore in rocks. Then you need to transport that iron ore on most likely a train to a factory where you melt down the iron ore to get it out of the rock to separate the iron out. And then you add carbon to it to make it steel. And then you have to refine it and roll it. You have to send it to another factory where there are specialized machines that turn that iron or that steel rather into the final piece of whatever it's going to be. Is it going to be a steel plate for a ship? Is it going to be a steel I-beam for a skyscraper? Whatever it is. So let's say in this example, there are 4 steps between the raw material in the earth and the finished product. Well, what Carnegie understood was if I own every step of the process, so in this example, let's say there's 4 steps. Carnegie owns every part of this. He owns the mine, he owns the railroad cars that are moving the stuff from the mine. He owns the factories and all the machines that are going to smelt the steel, that are going to refine it into its end product. He owns all of this. So in this example, instead of this being 4 separate businesses, the mining business, and then they hand it over to the railroad business, and then they hand it over to the smelting business, right? Instead of that, it's all one huge company. And what that does is it reduces the overhead. It reduces the number of middlemen. Okay. Because in this example, if you're dealing with one company, that's one payroll, that's one insurance company, that's one set of employees, right? That's not four separate companies with four separate series of overheads, right? Four separate insurance companies, four separate payrolls, four separate this, four separate that. The more independent companies or middlemen are involved in a product, they each need to get a piece of the profit. And so the more companies are involved from the starting point to the finished product, by the time the product is finished and ready for the customer, it will be more expensive because more people were involved and they all had to get paid. You see what I'm saying? If it's all done through one company, it's streamlined, it's more efficient, and that means the product will be cheaper. So that's vertical integration, top to bottom. You own each step. Rockefeller in the oil company did vertical and horizontal. Let's do another example of vertical here. Let's say the product is meat. Well, cheeseburgers don't grow on trees, unfortunately. It's a multi-step process. And in this process, you start with the cattle, and then there's the slaughterhouse, there's the shipping and the railroad cars, there's the warehouses, there's the meat packing plant, and then there's the final delivery to the end product, whether it's a restaurant, a supermarket, whatever. Same principle. If the same company owns the farm and the cattle, owns the slaughterhouse, owns the railroad cars, owns the warehouse and the meat packing plant, there's less redundancy, there's fewer people involved, there's only one company instead of five or six or seven. That will make the end product cheaper. Vertical integration. So with Rockefeller and his oil, he owned the land where the oil was being extracted. He owned all the machines that are extracting the oil. He owns the railroad cars that are shipping the oil to the refinery where it's turned into gasoline. And he probably owns the gas station, right? That's vertical integration. Just like we saw in the last example with steel. Horizontal integration is side to side rather than top to bottom. Horizontal integration is kind of the classic form of monopoly where you go out and buy up all your competitors in that field. So in other words, with oil, for example, that would mean Rockefeller would buy up all of the other oil companies, and there was essentially one oil company that pretty much had a monopoly. And since there was one huge oil company, they were able to mass produce their product in a very efficient way and deliver a cheaper final product. So these business strategies, they make goods and services more widely available and more affordable, which is good, but at what cost? And so the concern was that these companies are getting too big and too influential and too powerful. And we'll talk about what those concerns were in a minute. But this is the first time in the course, and not the last time, where this idea of social Darwinism comes into play. We'll talk about different examples of it later in the course. They're introducing it here because we're talking about business, and social Darwinism applies to different parts of life, but one would be business. So, if you've heard of Charles Darwin, wrote on The Origin of Species, probably one of the most, in a secular sense, one of the most five influential books ever written. Okay. Um, in terms of how it changed the way millions of people looked at the world. And he basically lays out modern evolutionary theory in that book, as you probably know. And if you boil down his argument to a bumper sticker, it's survival of the fittest. So he's talking about nature. Why do certain animals survive and other animals go extinct? And what he proposed was survival of the fittest. Whoever adapts to whatever animal adapts to its environment most successfully will survive because they're most fit, and whoever's unfit will not survive and will eventually go extinct. And that's just nature. That's just how it works. Now, social Darwinism is taking that idea of survival of the fittest and applying it not to animals, but to human behavior, to human interactions on a micro level, a small level, and a macro level. So, in the context of business, a lot of people were worried that businessmen like Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller, etc., were too big, too rich, too powerful. And that was a concern that people had. And what the social Darwinists would say is, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. It's survival of the fittest. If Ford makes a better car than his competitors and he crushes his competitors and they go out of business, there's nothing wrong with that. That's natural. That's like a certain animal going extinct. You might feel bad for them, but that's just how the world works. There's competition in nature and in human behavior. And when there's competition, you know what? Someone's going to lose. And we shouldn't look at that as a bad thing or an unnatural thing. That's the way the world works. That's the way the animal kingdom works, and that's the way business works. That's what the social Darwinists would say, right? Survival of the fittest. Why does, Amazon crush its competitors? Oh, survival of the fittest. They're better at what they do. And maybe someday someone will be better than Amazon and Amazon will go out of business, and too bad for them. That's what happens in business. That's the social Darwinist view. Now, the concern with these businesses getting so big and so powerful was monopoly. The idea that certain companies, Ford with cars, Carnegie with steel, Rockefeller with oil, the concern was they're too big. And when monopoly controls all of a certain field, all of a certain product or service, that creates danger. And one of the theoretical dangers you can see in this cartoon here from the time, all these huge figures in the background there is trust, right? Copper trust, steel trust. Trust is another word for monopoly. So these are big businesses. And you can see that in this cartoon, these big businesses are controlling our government. They're bigger and more powerful than our actual government. And if you look up in the balcony on the second floor there, see People's Entrance and it's closed. So this cartoonist is saying, hey, when businesses are as big as they are and as rich as they are, they're so powerful that our government is going to listen to them rather than to normal people. That was a big concern from a lot of people, and it still is to this day. So, in theory, what's good about a monopoly? Well, monopolies can be very efficient and get you high quality goods for low cost, and that's awesome. But on the downside, they could become too powerful, and that could cause corruption and abuse. It's a very important thing for you to think about. Now, in the modern context, do we have monopolies? It's in the eye of the beholder. Technically, we're not supposed to, but in the real world, you could argue that we kind of do. National Grid. In our part of the country, National Grid basically has, they keep renaming themselves. I don't know what their name is now, but it's National Grid. Um, National Grid essentially has a monopoly on electricity. If you live in New England and you have electricity, which it's a necessity, of course you do, chances are 90% that you get your electricity from National Grid and that there is no alternative. Okay. A lot of people think that's a danger. National Grid can jack up their prices because there's no competition. National Grid can provide poor quality service because there's no competition. And when there's no competition, you have no leverage. So in this context of National Grid, if there were three major electric companies in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and you didn't like National Grid, you could say to National Grid, you know what? You're increasing your prices too much. There's another power company that isn't doing that. I'm leaving you. I'm taking my business and going to them. But if you don't have that option, National Grid, in theory, can abuse you and there's nothing you can do about it. That's the theoretical danger of monopoly. The rest of these examples are mostly social media sites. And this is something I think worth you thinking about Google is, I think, probably the best example for your generation to understand the idea of monopoly. Google, in the eyes of many people, you could certainly argue that Google is a monopoly. All right. Think about it like this. And there's so many facets of Google, right? Google owns YouTube, first of all. It's important that you understand that. I don't know anyone that doesn't use YouTube. YouTube's fantastic. I use it every day. Um, but when you're using YouTube, you're using Google, right? So Google is so powerful that it owns things that you may not even realize you own. So believe me, everyone uses Google, whether they realize they're doing it or not. Okay. And there's the Gmail and there's all kinds of stuff Google does. But let's think about just the search engine, just that part of Google, right? The search engine. When you, if I ask you some random piece of information, who won the World Series in 1987? And you need to find that out. Think about this. How would you find out that piece of information? Do you see where this is going? You would look it up on the internet in all likelihood. And what verb do you use? What verb do you use to describe the process of finding out a piece of information online? Your friend comes to you and needs to know what, they're looking for a piece of information. What do you tell them to do? You ever think about this? You Google it. Who won the World Series in 1987? I don't know. Google it. What's the atomic number of beryllium? I don't know. Google it. You ever think about this? That's power. The name of a private company, Google, that company is so powerful that the name of the company is a verb. You Google something. I can't think of a parallel. All right. I have a Mazda. When I drive to work, I don't describe that as I need to Mazda to work, but I say I Google stuff. I Google stuff all the time. It's crazy, right? Think about that. That's power. And what do they control? Well, they control the most dominant search engine that there is by far. What's Google's closest competitor? I have no idea in terms of a search engine. Is it Bing maybe? You ever hear someone say Bing it? Hey, I need to know you know, I need to know who is the king of France in 1712. Just Bing it. Nobody says that. Nobody says Bing it. You Google it. Okay? What do they control? They control Google. They control the flow of information. When you want to know something, 9 times out of 10, you go to Google. Google has the power to decide what you see and what you don't see. That is power. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you're thinking about monopoly and what could be dangerous, that's power. Go to Google News and the top stories and the top sites, the top websites that are always at the top of the Google News feed, they all, nearly all, I'm going to say 90%. 90% of what you will see on the Google News algorithm is all from a certain worldview. 90% of it is, okay? So if you want to know what's going on in the world, which you should, and you go through Google, that's great. I use Google every day, don't get me wrong, but please understand what you're getting. You're getting information fed through one company with a specific worldview. And we all have a worldview, nothing wrong with that. But when you go to the Google News algorithm on any day about any given topic, what you will see is CNN, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, NBC News, CBS News. What do all of those sources have in common? They all hate, and I don't use that word lightly, all of those news sources hate President Trump to a degree that is difficult to articulate. Now, maybe you do too. That's fine. No problem. That's not the point. The point is, this man was elected the president and it wasn't particularly close. But if you look at Google, you would think that 90% of the country despises everything he does and says and stands for. And that's not true. Maybe you wish it were true, but it's not true. Right? So who gets to control the flow of information? That is incredible power. That's monopoly power. And Google's a great example of that, right? Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Amazon, same ideas with Google. These companies are so big and so dominant that they control the flow of certain information, and there's power there. With Disney, you might find this one interesting, and you can do a current event on any issue of any of these companies or others that you think might be too big, too powerful, whatever it is. Look, Apple, if we were in person, I would ask you, show of hands, how many of you have a smartphone? All of you have a smartphone. If I ask you, and I've done this in many, many classes, how many of you have an Apple iPhone? 90% of you have an Apple iPhone. And ironically, I am interrupted by my Apple iPhone ringing. Um, is that a monopoly? Apple has pretty much a monopoly on the smartphone market. Good for them. They make a great quality product. Everyone wants to buy it. People don't really want to buy a Samsung Galaxy. All right, it's a free country. What's the problem? Some people say there is no problem. It's social Darwinism. Some people say, no, 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 these companies are too big. They're too powerful. One last thing, Disney, if that jumps out at you, Disney, really? If you're interested in this, Google it. There it is. Uh, look up companies that Disney owns. Companies owned by Disney. All right, Google it. And you will see that Disney owns companies that it might surprise you. Like, whoa, how can this company so big? How could another company own it? Disney owns Marvel. So all that billion-dollar property with the movies and the comics and right, they own Marvel. They own Star Wars, much to my dismay. Disney owns ESPN. Did you know that? When you're watching SportsCenter, you're watching Disney. Disney owns Hulu and other streaming services. Disney owns ABC, which means they own ABC News. And so when you go on the Google News feed, and ABC News is at the top of the page almost every day, Google is pushing Disney by virtue of pushing ABC News. And do you think ABC News is going to do any kind of reporting that might make Disney look bad? I kind of doubt it because Disney owns ABC News. So there's a lot there to think about. Very important, timely issue. Is there any danger in companies being too big, in your opinion? Definitely worth thinking through. The Sherman Antitrust Act. So this was a law passed as a reaction to concern about these companies getting so big. And it technically said monopolies are illegal. Okay, that's fine. One of the problems that people realized was how do we actually implement that? Um, it lacked a clear legal definition of what a monopoly even was. And if you're going to make something illegal, you have to you have to define what it is. And there's no operative language in the law that defines. So what is a monopoly? Is it a company that has 100% control over a certain product? Well, yeah, that would be. Well, what about 90%? Isn't that a monopoly? Yeah, probably. What about 73%? Is that a monopoly? So they didn't really have a specific definition. Um, One of the biggest, more modern cases bought under this law was Microsoft. So Microsoft, as you know, huge influential company. And 20 years ago, the government took Microsoft to court and said, you are basically a monopoly. There's not enough competition, and we're going to break you up. We're going to force other, we're going to break you up so that other computer companies and software companies can compete with you. And you can see from the data here, it didn't really hurt Microsoft to have this, have the government come after them and break them up. Their sales went up, their profits went up, as you can see. And so then, look, the question becomes like with the iPhone is a great example. The huge overwhelming majority of Americans want an iPhone. No one's putting a gun to your head and making you buy an iPhone. You're doing it because you want to. You think that product makes your life better, easier, more convenient, more fun, whatever reason you have, you are willingly buying that phone. You're not being forced to. You could choose to buy a Samsung Galaxy. You could choose to buy a Google Pixel. Is that a thing? I don't know. You could choose not to have a phone. You don't need to buy the iPhone. You're choosing to buy the iPhone. It's a great product, right? Now, how would you feel if the government came along and said, you know what? Too many people have iPhones. We're going to go after Apple. Would that make sense to you? It's the same question with Microsoft. Now, as businesses began to grow larger and more powerful, and there were monopolies emerging and all that, workers are concerned, and they begin to form unions with collective bargaining. And the idea behind collective bargaining is strength in numbers, right? You have all the workers bargain for how much are we going to get paid, how many hours do we have to work, whatever, not as individuals, but as big groups in unions. And the theory is you will get better treatment that way because you have strength in numbers. One of the accomplishments of the early labor movement was an 8-hour workday. And if you work more than 8 hours, overtime kicks in. You shouldn't take that for granted. And another was the end to child labor. So during this period, lots of kids were working in conditions that today we would never tolerate for kids or adults, incredibly dirty, dangerous conditions. We'll get into that in more depth in the next unit. Who may have opposed ending child labor? This might surprise you. There's an obvious answer and a kind of counterintuitive answer, as with so many other things in life. Who would oppose ending child labor? Well, the obvious answer is probably the factory owners, right? They like child labor. They can pay them less. You know, kids are very useful in factories. They have small hands and they can reach into the machines when something gets stuck, right? So the business owners, they want child labor. That shouldn't surprise you. Here's what might surprise you. Another group of people that opposed ending child labor was the parents of the children working in the factories. Now, why would a parent be upset? You would think that parents would be happy that the government outlawed child labor. Thank you, government. You saved my child from working in this awful factory, right? And think about it like this. Most parents don't want their children to be working in those types of conditions if they're good parents, right? So therefore, if a 10-year-old is working in a factory, it it might not be because the parents are monsters. It more likely is because the family needs the money, right? Makes sense? So when the government comes along and says, "Hey, guess what, parents? Your children can't work. You're welcome." A lot of the parents are like, "Excuse me, government, you're not helping. You're not helping. You're taking money out of our pockets. You're taking food out of our mouths. We need that extra income. We wish we didn't, but we do. That's why our 10-year-old is working. You're telling us now our 10-year-old can't work. They weren't as excited as you might think. They were actually upset, like, hey, government, mind your business. We need the extra money. How are we going to make up that extra money now? Now, here's the good news, and we'll get into this more in the next unit. This worked out great for everybody, ending child labor. Here's why. Supply and demand. Hopefully, you know the basics of this. Supply, how much of something is there? Demand, how badly do people want it? Price follows demand. When one goes up, the other one goes down. Usually, if something isn't high supply, it's cheap. If it's easy to get, it's relatively cheap. If something is very rare and low supply, demand is very high and it's more expensive, right? Diamonds are expensive because they're in low supply. Okay. In this context, when the government ended child labor, what did they do to the supply of labor? Well, they immediately lowered the supply of labor by removing all the children from the workplace. You with me? When supply goes down and there's less of a thing, in this case, there were fewer workers because no more kids could work. When supply goes down, demand goes up. If there's fewer workers available because you're removing the children, the supply went down. Now the demand goes up. Now the adult workers are more in demand. Therefore, they are more valuable. Therefore, they get paid more. Does that make sense? So this worked out for everybody. And we'll see in the next unit the other side of this coin. If you're going to end child labor, well, what are the kids going to be doing all day? Their parents are at work. The kids can't be running the streets. And the solution to that problem was mandatory public education. All right, so that's the end of this unit. The next unit kind of segues with a lot of these ideas, but hopefully you came up with some concepts that you could do current events about issues having to do with well, I guess maybe the biggest one would have been monopoly, and issues of concerns over companies getting too big, too influential. Is that corrupt? Is that dangerous for society? And then just the other issues of new technologies coming on. And it seems like every time you turn your head, there's a newer technology. And I hope you see a lot of parallels between this period and today with how quickly the world is changing. And what's on the horizon now for your generation that's going to really escalate all the stuff we've been talking about here is AI. And hopefully you can see some parallels there, right? For better or for worse, the world is going to change in the next 20 years in ways that we can't imagine. And that's a process that we can kind of trace back to these events that we've covered here. All right, so that's it for this module, and I will see you next time.